We're going to do some introductions here. So I'm Steve Blumenshine, Executive Director of Water. And then I want to take it around the room in our team in this effort. And then we have Blake. Blake Zanti, please introduce yourself a bit.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon. Blake Zanti. I'm the executive director of the Maddy Institute. We're a nonpartisan public policy institute that's partnered with the Valley's four public universities.
Great, thanks. And Austin Gilbert.
And I'm Austin Gilbert. I'm the district director for Assemblyman David Tangipa, located in Fresno.
Great. And Laura Ramos is here. She's one of our CSU-WATER Associate Directors, and she's the Executive Director of California Water Institute at Fresno State. I just want to get a little overview of how this uh, webinar series came about. It's been about 6 months in the works, and this came from a meeting I had in the Fresno office of Assemblyman David Tangipa. I mean, literally his office in Fresno, about two miles from where I'm sitting right now. And I was telling him about how much I've been discovering about California politics in the legislature by tracking Prop 4 in that rollout and sitting in some of the hearings with our committee consultants, which you'll hear from in a minute. And David mentioned to me, like, well, if you learned a lot, don't you think students need to learn something too, or something to that effect? And that's when a big light bulb went off. And we started talking and put together this legislative series. And we only did part of the lift. The people who were willing to spend their time and expertise in contributing this are really is what's making it work. So there's interesting background there. We'll also share that among the registrants we had through the standard process, and there's a watch party at CSU Stanislaus, we know. So there's a group there following this in a classroom, for example. So briefly covering the agenda, we have two main groups today. We have committee consultants from Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife and the Senate Natural Resources and Water, as well as the Senate Environmental Quality Committee. They'll talk about some of the logistics of ideas and how they become regulations and the pathways there. Then we have a group of legislators and someone representing water industry who works with the legislators. And we will allow them to introduce themselves, of course, talk about some of the issues within our framework for today's session one of our series. And then one thing we've done with other webinars, and we naturally continued it here, is that when students register for one of our webinar events that's usually connected to workforce development in the water sectors, we encourage them to enter a question for our guests and panelists. And so we have quite a roster of questions, and we've gone through those and vetted them and assigned them to different groups. And I want to cover some of the types of questions that we got, which are better suited for some of our other forums. So, for example, some of the questions were things like, could we ask questions about internships with any of the listed people in your event? Or how about joining the workforce by industry field through non-traditional means? Or what about students without experience? Can they get internships and other entry-level qualifications? So those are the kind of questions we're not particularly going to deal with today because we don't have our water industry employers in the room necessarily, but rather the experts on what water careers and jobs will be needed in alignment with the policies that are currently in place and are likely to be in place. So what we're going to recommend to people with questions about that, like for the students for workforce entry and engagement, number one thing we always tell students is to get on LinkedIn, make a profile, check LinkedIn, have it deliver a summary to you because a lot of our water agency friends post all kinds of internship and career opportunities there. Another thing is there's job boards. We maintain a job board in our CSU Water website. It's basically a consolidation of others. And one of those sources, which you could check directly, is with our friends at CUA, CUWA, that's California Urban Water Agencies. And then we have some really good friends and partners that are really moving and shaking things in California in the water workforce world. And one of those is Tiffany Baca, and Jace is going to put it into the chat, her contact information. So Tiffany's, as you can see here, is executive director of the Water Energy Education Alliance. So that group, WEA, has over 250 entities involved in that, and they do some really great events there. So check out what Tiffany has and connect with her on LinkedIn. Then another one is Brenda Martinez. She's the Workforce Development Director for Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. It's the largest water district in the United States, and they have thousands of employees and all kinds of opportunities. And then we have some other friends and webinars that we'll connect with. One, I mentioned KUA, check out what they have in their agencies and such. So we're not going to talk about specific job aspects and entry force here, but rather a broader picture in the landscape as it goes through the California legislature, becomes policies, and those are adapted in practices in managing and distributing water in California and dealing with changing climate and unpredictable water resource and availability, for example. So with that, there's one other person that joined us in our group I want to introduce. Anya, could you turn your camera on? Anya Dogra, who is a student at San Jose State University, and she is an executive committee member on our CSU-WATER SOURCE student group. We love punny acronyms. So SOURCE is Student Outreach Unit for Research and Career Education. So she's a two-term member of that, and she'll be asking the questions that were submitted by the students to our panelists today. And with that, to open with our panel of committee consultants in the legislature, I'm going to turn it over to Blake.
Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate that overview. Again, I'm Blake Zanti, the Executive Director of the Maddy Institute. I have the privilege and honor of introducing our first round of panelists today to give a little bit of an overview on the legislative process. And I think Steve outlined it well, where we have a lot of students who are interested in making a difference in water policy or just learning about public policy in general and what does that process look like. And so we're really grateful to these guests joining us here today to help us give an overview of what that process looks like. And so I'll go ahead and introduce them right now. And before that, I know that we'll be talking with her in just a moment, but I did just want to give a quick acknowledgement. I see that Assemblymember Soria has joined us. And I know that my colleague Steve will be introducing her in just a moment for her part of the panel. So I just wanted to give her a quick shout out. Thank you for joining, Assembly Member. So joining us for our first panel, we have Pablo Garza, Chief Consultant for the Assembly Committee on Water, Parks, and Wildlife. Thanks for being here, Pablo. We have Genevieve Wong, Principal Consultant for the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Water. Thanks for being here, Genevieve. And then we have Taylor McKee, Consultant on the Senate Committee on Environmental Quality. Thanks for being here, Taylor. Really appreciate your time. And with that, I will turn it over to Anya.
Thank you for the introduction. So the actual question, what is the rate limiting step in drafting and implementing water policies? So what does a committee consultant do? What is the work of someone in a committee?
I guess I will go ahead and take the lead on that one. So generally speaking, what a committee consultant does is each of our committees have specific jurisdictions. And for the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee, it's all things relating to natural resources. We also do forestry and fire prevention and water. And what basically we help advise members of the legislature about the different issue areas within our committee. Additionally, we are responsible for analyzing legislation or bill proposals that are referred to our committee and giving advice to the members on maybe how we might think the bill could be improved to help make better public policy for the entire state. I think that's kind of a broad overview of what committee consultants do. I kind of think of ourselves as information providers. We gather the information and try and distill it down into a document known as a analysis to provide to the members of our committee, the legislature, and the public at large. But we are information providers and not necessarily decision makers. The decision makers are definitely the members of the legislature. And based on information that we might give them, then they make their decisions on how they feel about a particular bill proposal. I'll invite Pablo or Taylor to add anything that they think I might have missed.
I agree with your summary, Genevieve. I think that's a good outline. I'd say I've always felt our title is a little misleading. Like consultant makes you think of like a consulting firm or someone who bills by the hour. And we're more, like Genevieve said, information providers or policy analysts. A lot of reading and writing, a lot of meetings.
Great. And Taylor, anything that you wanted to add to that as well?
Nothing to add. I feel like Genevieve and Pablo covered it very well, but we are happy to kind of walk through the process of bill introduction, if that seems appropriate.
Yeah, why don't we transition to that? How do bills get introduced, and maybe if you could just share a little bit more about that process.
Absolutely. I believe there is a graphic that could come on screen. Awesome. So here is an overview of the full legislative process as far as bill introduction. And as you know, as I walk through this, we'll also kind of point places in which students and faculty members have the opportunity to get involved in this process. So kind of starting out with bill introduction, we have 120 members across the California Senate and the Assembly, and each of them can introduce up to 35 bills over the course of a 2-year cycle. And so really think of bills as ideas to make state policy better, to make what we're doing in California better for society. And so these ideas can really come from anywhere. They can come from constituents in a particular district. They can come from members themselves. They can come from their staff. They could also come from lobbying organizations or external organizations. Some members even have places on their website where anyone can submit an idea for a bill. And usually bills tend to align with what a member's priority is. So if a member really cares about housing or education, you're more likely to see bills in those spaces under those priorities. And so that's kind of how bill introduction works. But going through the entire process, after a bill gets introduced, it goes to the Rules Committee, and that's where the Rules Committee decides where a bill gets referred to. So if a bill covers education issues, it might go to the Committee on Education. If it covers health, it might go to the Committee on Health. One particular example that's relevant to water that came through both EQ and the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee is SB 31 last year, which dealt with recycled water. It was referred to those two committees because natural resources and water deals with water supply and demand and understanding how to best steward our valuable resource that is water. And it also came to the Environmental Quality Committee because that's more concerned about the quality of the water and how it might impact human health for people who engage with the recycled water in their community. So after bills get referred, it goes to those policy committees, to which Genevieve kind of described the role of a policy consultant very well there, where we will have a lot of meetings. We will engage with a lot of different stakeholders. We'll kind of look at the problem and really understand the problem and understand what the bill is trying to address within that problem. We might get direction from the chair on how to move with that particular bill. And I would like to point out that this is also a space where we welcome engagement with anybody who has either expertise on the issue or has an important point on the issue, any stakeholders that this issue might impact or the bill might impact. Policy committee is an excellent way to engage with the process. And you can do that just by reaching out to us. Our information are on our websites for each policy committee. And consultants tend to be pretty friendly when welcoming this sort of information that could be helpful for our members. And so after we sort of gather all this information, we will draft our bill analyses. We might undergo negotiation with different stakeholders. We might propose amendments, figuring out how to make the bill better and how to make sure that it's workable and implementable for the state. Our chair will brief committee staff so they can better inform their members how to vote. And we might even provide vote recommendations, I know, or even not voting at all. From there, we'll have our bill hearings in policy committee. And so that's where members have an opportunity to have discourse over the bill. The author of the bill will introduce it through presentation and then might invite even some testimony to share why the bill is needed. From there, we'll have time for support and opposition to make their case on a bill, and members will continue their discussion and ultimately vote on a bill. If it gets majority vote in most cases, it will pass the policy committee. If it does not get majority vote in most cases, it will fail and die in the committee. And then moving on to the finance committee, if a bill has any cost to the state, it will go to what's on this infographic as the Finance Committee, which in our case we call appropriations. Once it goes to appropriations, if it's above a certain threshold, it will go on something called suspense. And if it's below a certain threshold in terms of cost, it can go straight to the floor. And this is where members really get to decide what are their priorities, what can we really afford with the state and state funding, and how are we going to sort of move along bills that should make it to the floor. If they do not make it off the suspense, they'll die in the Appropriations Committee, and then they'll go to the floor. And this is where all members have the opportunity to vote yes, no, or not voting on a particular bill. I want to point out that this is another space where anyone can engage, anyone can lobby the members and try to influence how they vote on a particular bill. So once it completes that entire process and a bill makes it off the floor, meaning in most cases, a majority of members have voted yes on the bill. It will go to the other house, which is the assembly on this diagram, and it will complete that process once again. Once it passes that process and makes it off the floor of the second house, if there are any substantial amendments, it will go back to the first house on a concurrence vote. And if it passes that vote, then it goes to the governor's desk. If it doesn't need a concurrence vote, it will also go to the governor's desk. And that's where the governor and his agencies can decide, does this bill make sense for the state? And he'll either decide to veto a bill, sending it back to the member, to which the member can either run the bill with some suggested changes or take a different approach, or he'll sign the bill, in which the bill becomes a law. And that is how a bill becomes a law.
Thanks so much for that helpful overview, Taylor. I think it's really helpful to share with students and others who maybe aren't as familiar with the legislative process, just a brief overview of how it works. And I think our main points were covered, and now it's time to transition to our student submitted questions. So I'll turn it back over to Anya.
Thank you, Blake. And also thank you so much, Taylor. That was a very informative infographic and discussion presentation. So one of the first questions is, what is the limiting step in drafting and implementing water policy? And what is the timeline for creating new policy or approving and seeing it in action?
I think it's a first shot at that question, and then I'm sure Taylor and Genevieve have things to add. But I think water policy is complicated and controversial. You've probably all heard, or maybe you haven't heard, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, kind of saying. I hate to repeat it, but it's true. And they attribute that to Mark Twain. So I think I think there's a lot. I think the complexity and the political considerations are one of the limiting factors to moving whatever your policy proposal is forward. And so there's just kind of a history of intense fights over water allocation and water policy in the state. So that can make it difficult. One of our colleagues or former colleagues said it was a full contacts war, and I think that's an appropriate way to characterize it. And I think the last thing I'd say on it is, one of the nice things about water policy, and this is what I've chosen to work on for my career, and I think it's fascinating, but it's not I wouldn't say it as partisan. It's more regional, kind of where you're at has more to do with, and where your water's coming from has more to do with how you view it than kind of party politics. So in a sense, that's nice. You still get some definite kind of north-south, inland, coastal fights over water resources, but I find that it tends to be a little less partisan than maybe some other issues.
And I guess I'll add, add a little bit to that in what I think can make water policies sometimes difficult to, change and implement or pass, is it's an extremely complicated system, and it's both on how, even our water rights system is very complicated. We have this whole pre-1914 not versus, and pre-1914 water rights with post-1914 water rights, but then also riparian rights and appropriative rights. And it's very complicated. And I think, there's a lot of different tensions between a lot of different stakeholder groups that different pieces of legislation needs to consider. We're all sort of interconnected by water and for all different reasons. And, people who, you know, live in Southern California might rely heavily on water that's coming from the State Water Project or the Central Valley Water Project. And, um, they see it as, well, we need this water. But then on the flip side, there's other regions of the state that also might need that water for different reasons. And so I think that's probably one of the main things that makes sometimes water policy so difficult to um, do because of how contentious and how many different stakeholder groups tend to be involved. Um, and, you had also asked, what is the timeline for creating a new policy, approving and seeing it in action? And, while some legislation can, the bill that Taylor had mentioned, SB 31, some legislation can get introduced and passed in a year. But other pieces of legislation, some, major reform acts can take literally decades of negotiations and brainstormings and trying to figure out a path forward. One example of that, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which was passed back in 2014. Even though, it was enacted in 2014, that was the result of many, 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 many years of conversations that predated before I even, started in working in the water environment.
Thank you so much. That was really informative, and I think it gives an idea to those interested in the water industry and policy to bridge those gaps that we're currently facing. It seems like there's a lot of communication that should be happening across different sectors and bridging gaps between like industry, policy, and even academia. So I'm going to transition this over to Steve for the next section, which will cover a little bit more about the assembly members and impactful water policies and influence on some workforce.
Thanks, Anya, and everybody. You heard Genevieve mentioned Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. Obviously, that's going to be something we'll touch on in each of the sessions. It's going to be an enduring thing that everyone in the state has to deal with, whatever, regardless of how water is being used in most cases. Okay, for this section, we have our first legislative panel and water industry representative who works with the legislature. So I'll do some quick introductions and bios that were provided by they or their staffs. So first, we're very honored to have Assemblywoman Esmeralda Soria. She serves as California's 27th Assembly District Representative, serving the regions of Merced, Madera, and West Fresno counties. She's currently serving her second consecutive term. Since 2023, Soria has served as chairwoman of the Assembly Agriculture Committee. She also serves as a member of the governmental organization Banking and Finance and the Economic Development, Growth, and Household Impact Communities. Does anyone have that memorized, Assemblywoman? Or do they have to read it like I did? So we're great to have you here, and your legislative director, Arturo, is here as well. I've been having some discussions with him. You may find out about any time now. If you could talk about your perspectives here on current water policy and what's happening in your district, your committee, and that water policy focus from the Ag Committee.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve, and thank you everyone who has joined us this afternoon. Obviously, appreciate CSU-WATER for organizing the webinar, the partnership with the Maddy Institute. Obviously, I think what we know is that water policy affects all Californians in every aspect because water touches, I think, all of us in our lives. And I think this event is extremely important to help us demystify the legislature's role in developing new policy and how the next generation of, professionals and future leaders can begin to advocate issues related to water now, to be able to have an impact for policies that, may take years, as Genevieve mentioned earlier in her comments, to really develop. And so as the chair of not only the agricultural committee, but as someone that has, been born and raised in the Central Valley, and I'm a daughter of farm workers, obviously intimately have been impacted by water, the lack thereof, and also the challenges of safe drinking water in communities, especially rural communities that are severely disadvantaged in our area. And so for me, when I'm thinking about water and the connection to agriculture, obviously is extremely critical and important, given how big of an industry it is in California. And also given the fact that agriculture is one of the many industries that makes the state of California the fourth largest economy in the world. And so in my region, just to give you guys a little bit of context, you mentioned I represent Assembly District 27, which incorporates the Fresno, Madera, and Merced counties. In these three counties, we are responsible for about 28% of California's total agricultural production. And obviously, none of that production can happen without water. And so one of the challenges I have seen being in the legislature, just kind of point blank, is that sometimes even water policy happens in silos. And even though I I chair the agriculture committee, we don't oversee water issues that impact agriculture. All of those issues are actually they go through the assembly, the other committee of water parks and wildlife. Water Parks and Wildlife. I forget the committee name. And so we have attempted to kind of, begin some discussions where we jointly work together to ensure that we are making sure that when water policy is coming through the legislative process, that when it's necessary to bring an agricultural lens, that we do lend that, so that the policy actually can be beneficial to not just agricultural, but to all the interests that may be impacted as a result of policy. I think, just want to go back to one of the biggest reforms that happened, which was SGMA back in 2014, as was mentioned also by Genevieve. This has been an issue that has impacted farmers tremendously. And, I think obviously this was passed long ago, way before also my time. But I actually was an advocate back in the day, pre-SGMA, trying to figure out how also water basins that were significantly depleted and that it ended up impacting in connection to also the quality of water was a challenge, especially in regions like mine. And so I recognize, the intent and the importance of having these types of policies. But I also believe that, now, especially that the policy has been in place over a decade and it's taken so much time in terms of implementation, we're seeing now the regional basins being established and developing their own kind of regional also policies as they've been implementing the statewide policy, that it is important to take into account some of the learned lessons in terms of the implementation, and where there's gaps, to be able to come back to the legislature and say like, hey, we need to fix this because this may not be working in the same way that we thought that it would work. And so we are constantly, I would never consider myself a water expert, but I definitely partner up and use those folks that are in the industry and those different stakeholders to make sure that as we're either crafting policy or as we are analyzing and vetting policy, that have to take a vote on, that I'm making sure that what are some of the intended consequences, and what are the benefits that the policy may have also, and that are important for especially the region that I represent. And so in my short time being in the legislature, we've been focused on recharging the aquifer. One of the issues that I early worked on was connected to flooding in my district because of what happened in Merced County in 2023, and that early January we saw those big storms that end up impacting communities like Planada and Atwater, McSwain, and Merced County. And so learning that there were some regulatory challenges, and so we supported the governor's efforts through executive order to be able to streamline some of those challenges to better take advantage of some of that flood waters to be able to recharge the aquifer, because there are a tremendous amount of benefits also to intentionally recharging the aquifer that historically had been we've been extracting water without replenishing it. And so I think that we had some good lessons learned that we were able to put into practice in the last couple of years. And I'm hoping that as we've taken some of those lessons, that we're able to also adjust policy kind of on a long-term basis. But also it demonstrates the need for us to have flexibility in policy to be able to adjust to the climate changes that are happening, not just globally, but I think in our communities when we're looking at different weather patterns. And so I've been a big advocate of also infrastructure investments that are related for water, especially creating these recharge bases and recharge opportunities. We invested some dollars in this program called FloodMar, which has resulted in much success. And so, and these are types of projects that also the agricultural industry has seen as a win-win. And they've been eager to be not just participants, but actually partners in having also skin in the game and realizing that we can't continue to do and to operate the same way that we operated before, but that we need to be innovative and partner up, because obviously it is sometimes expensive to be able to construct these types of infrastructure projects. But there are obviously long-term benefits. And so it's been pretty awesome to be on the ground when I've toured several of these recharge floodmar basins in my district to see how quickly they were able to stand those up, and then also the large benefit that comes out of these types of projects. And so that's kind of some of the work. Also, I'll just mention that in my short time, we worked on the climate bond, which all the voters ended up supporting. There were some ag-related investments and also other ag-related investments, non-water investments that were included in Prop 4, which we are excited to be able to see how the legislature will implement them. And, obviously I'll be a part of that process to ensure that we use those investments in the best possible way, given some of the things that we've learned that work and that will essentially help with the supply and reliability and the issues of clean drinking water that we've had in many of the communities that I've represented and that continue to exist throughout the rural parts of California. And so with that, I don't know if you guys have specific questions for me, but happy to answer any questions. And I do believe I saw Senator Laird join us. So
yeah, we'll
welcome my colleague.
We'll get through our other two guests, then we'll have open it up for questions. And I like what you mentioned. Two of the words you used in referring to Sigma towards your closing there was partnerships and financials. And we're always going to have to bring this back to the economics. It just is going to come down to that regardless, either directly or indirectly. And then one of our featured guests for our session 2 next Thursday afternoon is Paul Gosselin. For those of you in the audience who haven't heard that name, he runs the Sigma program for DWR. And like Paul tells us, the first 10 years of Sigma were for engineering. Now is the time for social science. And we're seeing that in some of the GSAs and their formations and their differing degrees of functionality, for example. So I want to move over to Senator John Laird. Senator, I got it. This is in all due respect. You're one of the two people in our entire webinar series I haven't met personally yet. So I'm really great you're here, and your staff has been absolutely fantastic. And I hear, for example, you were driving from Sacramento to your home on the Central Coast and made time for this session, which is just it's so impressive. We're so grateful. So I'll read your bio that was provided. You represent the 17th District, which includes Santa Cruz, San Benito, Monterey, and most of San Luis Obispo County. A seasoned lawmaker, he now serves as the chair of the Senate Budget Committee and holds key roles on multiple other influential committees, such as Natural Resources and Water, Judiciary, and Local Government. In his first term, Senator Laird had 59 bills signed into law. Wow. On issues including climate resilience and sustainable agriculture, among others. With a long record of public service, including as Natural Resources Secretary. So you were Wade Crowfoot's predecessor, is that right? State Assembly member and former mayor of Santa Cruz. That sounds like a fun job. Senator Laird continues to bring deep experience and results-driven leadership to the Central Coast in California. So if you could give your perspectives from your deep and impactful experience on like some of the current water policies and what those might mean for workforce for the many university students in our audience here, please. And then we'll have some time with Soren Nelson of Aqua.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm actually in the Ferry Building in San Francisco, where I just moderated a panel and stepped off the stage and walked to this room to be able to talk to you. And it's great to be with Assemblymember Soria, who I hope I will be serving with in the Senate next year, and Soren Nelson, who by the end of my term, I'm determined to vote for something he asks for. It's a struggle, but I have been getting there. I had two things in opening comments to speak to your question. And the first one is I know there are a lot of students that are on this Zoom. And I just want to tell you that when I was an undergraduate a very long time ago, I wrote an undergraduate thesis on the history of water development in California and got honors. It actually got me honors at graduation from UC Santa Cruz. And at the time, I thought, oh, geez, I'm a bit of enviro. I'm from the coast, Central Valley agriculture, urban Southern California. That's who drives water policy. I will never be able to impact water policy. And then I turned out to be the governor's point person for 8 years on water and have done an amazing number of the bills I have had signed in this arena. And it just means that if you're sitting there thinking this is not me or I'm not going to be able to penetrate into this, think again. You can figure out a way to be involved in this in a way that is meaningful. And the second thing I wanted to say is that has given me a sweep of history. I hate to say it, but that thesis was just over 50 years ago. And I went to work for a member of Congress who represented the Delta upon graduation. And it has turned out that almost every one of my positions, I have been the lead on water. I have been in the middle of water issues. And so I have seen this sweep of history because when I wrote my thesis and the California Water Project was really coming online, there was no California Environmental Quality Act. There was no Clean Water Act. It turns out that a lot of the infrastructure that we built before environmental laws. And in many ways, the fights have been over retroactively making our infrastructure environmentally sound and in sync with the law. And I don't know that there'd been subsidence or other issues at the time that I wrote about water. And yet, as Assemblymember Soria said, that is central to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and what's going on in the Central Valley. And at the same time, we historically, 3 million acres of irrigated agriculture and 25 million people rely on water systems that originate in the Sierra Nevada mountains from the snowpack. and we have climate change. And it is estimated that the snowpack will continue to shrink over the next decades, and yet our water system is attuned to that. So what do we do in the changing? Our water system was built in one climate, and we are living in another. And that means the difference in snow, the sort of overdrafting, the severe droughts that alternate with flooding in severe rainstorms. And that is what we have to accommodate in our water planning and water policy. When I was in the Assembly, 2002 to 2008, I did a large series of bills on water conservation. And it was interesting because at the time, there was not much of an ethic of water conservation. And there was a view that if you saved water or you advocated for it, you're an environmentalist trying to keep from building other things. And it was just sort of a shill as an issue. And yet over time, it's been realized that that is a key part of what we have to do. And the latest water projections or of water consumption show that water consumption is down substantially in parts of the state because the true water conservation programs have kicked in. And whether it's routing out turf, whether it's more efficient washers or dishwashers, all those things have led to a change in demand. And then it just leads to the question you're all asking is, where do I fit in on this? Where are there jobs? Where are there opportunities? And there are real opportunities in so many different pieces. We have moved to science as being an underlying part of all this. Water engineering is a big deal given what we have to do in the changing system and moving from one place to another. The economics of this have changed. So there's actually a role for people as economists in this. And the water policy is something that is at the center of everything. And there's some real places for analysts, for legislative assistants, for people to be involved. And so here we have this changing water system and changing demands and changing things we have to do. And it actually is creating jobs that I never would have envisioned when I was in college because the whole substance of it has changed. So that is what I just wanted to say in opening comments. And I look forward to any questions or discussion that we will have.
Thanks so much. A quick comment on that. And what I heard from our external networks, which are pretty broad in 2025, what sticks with me is the need for students entering the workforce with communication skills and financial economic skills and acumen. So we're good with engineers. There's a lot of engineers, and they're very important, but we need these other disciplines involved as well. So one of our taglines for CSU-WATER is STEM can't do it alone. We need more. So I'm going to move on to Soren Nelson, and we'll see if we have some time for the student submitted questions there. So Soren, I see you every time all over the state. I didn't see you Monday at the California Irrigation Institute event, where Assemblyman Adam Gray was the keynote speaker there. He had some interesting things to say. I thought I heard the same things from David Valadeo, but that's a whole different discussion. So Soren is a senior policy advocate at the Association of California Water Agencies, also known as ACWA, which represents nearly 470 public water agencies across the state. In his role, Soren leads ACWA's lobbying efforts on a variety of issues in front of the Newsom administration and the state capitol. So what are you seeing in the ACWA legislative connector world, Soren, and how are you bridging those gaps?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And the reason you didn't see me at the irrigation event is because I was at a different competing water event, as there always seems to be more than one can attend. I think the push and pull between the water industry and the legislature is that most of water policy and water work happens at a local level. For better or for worse, local water agencies are responsible for 85% of the spending and investment in water in California. The state is, maybe 10%, and the feds are 5%, and that's diminishing. So a lot of the work is happening at the local community level. One of the challenges that we have is that our North Star is to deliver safe water that is affordable for people to buy. And there's a real balance between how do we make sure that our water is safe to drink and respects our state's ideals around protecting the environment, but is not $300 a month. And that's a really hard balance to strike. The legislature has big ideas about water conservation, environmental protection. There's a new mandate to change all of our public fleets over to electric vehicles, and that's resulting in big rate increases across the state. So there's a real tension between getting water from where it is to where it's needed, where it's clean and safe, and also meeting the aspirational goals of the legislature. So that's kind of where we see the interactions between the water industry and the legislature.
Good to know. Just keep an eye on the clock here a little bit. I'm just going to grab one or two of the student questions. So I draw from this, and if you don't know, if this is out of your area of expertise, I understand. But I'll use Anya, our executive committee member in our source group. She tells a great story about how when she was a freshman, she had a research opportunity in her civil engineering program at San Jose State, and that was the clincher, like fish on the line. She was bought in. I remember those days too, getting fascinated by something and making decisions right there. Some say it's as young as fourth grade. We're still trying to figure that out in the water workforce world, where that sweet spot is. And so we're working with KUA, Aqua, and other water agencies to get research and research examples or case studies in the classrooms to further engage students towards water careers. So for the three of you here, we have a couple minutes. Can you speak to how water research findings find their way into policy, municipal water agencies, or tribal governments? I know I read that question submitted by a student, and if you're in the room, all credit to you. So asking the tough questions, panelists. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'll take a stab at that, and I have to take a jab at Soren just because the convention where I am that I just moderated a panel is on electric vehicles, and I'm going to walk out and tell them that you think they're really causing problems for you. So that's going to be a lot of fun on my way out. I think that this is a central question is the role of science, and science is at the center. You cannot do a water project without environmental review. An environmental review is based on the science, and whether it's the Delta project, whether it was the taking down of the Klamath dams, whether it is some of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act agencies that Assemblymember Soria mentioned, that is the center. And yet it also needs to be in our policy making, and that is the struggle. And we do have in the legislature, and I was going to call this out for the students, if you've completed your graduate work in any way on this, we have science fellows, and we have a class every year, and they get placed with different legislators. And I mean, now the chief consultant of the Natural Resources Committee in the Senate is a former science fellow.
We have Taylor McKee here. She was a fellow with CCST.
That's it. That's exactly what we're talking about. It's an annual thing, and it's something people should consider. And to the extent we don't have many, but we finally pay interns now. And we have money to do that, at least in the Senate. And that is really helpful because we try to find people that might be building on their expertise. And my own nephew, who works for the State Water Board now, got his master's and admittedly through the UC system, but in a way that he studied the science and he's able to put the science to work in his job. And it really is a difference. When I was resources secretary, and I don't think this was necessarily true, I had a science advisor on oil and gas. We had a whole team of scientists that decided about where the marine protected area should go and that it's based on science. We had a whole level of science that has dealt with the Delta and the ecosystem there and how you fit any water extraction in balance with protecting what needs to be done for the ecosystem there and the health of the San Francisco Bay. And it is trying to figure out, admittedly, how to crack that, to get in as a fellow, to get in as an intern. I take students from higher education, and if they're doing it as classwork, we can't pay them, but we will place them in the office, and we will try to assign them tasks that are consistent with what their academic work is. And that's how I got into it. And I am always conscious of that and want to offer those opportunities. And science is at the center of it.
We'd love to follow up with you on that. Assemblymember Soria, a minute or two remarks on that, please. To close this out, bring us home.
Ditto to all of what Senator Laird said. I think that he's even a perfect example of just, how research and water research, he just mentioned, in his opening that he did this paper when he was an undergrad, and he's been, I think, one of the legislators that has been really active in the water space, obviously relying on a lot of also the other experts within science. I do believe that we do need to use more of that. I think that's why it's so important for the investments, not only that we continue to make in higher education, because a lot of the research is happening in these institutions of higher learning. Like today, we just in the assembly, we approved a bill that is going to the Senate related to investing in the experimental research farms at institutions like Fresno State, UC Merced, and all these other universities that have these, research experimental research farms that will look at water and how water efficiency can be looked at, and policy and all of those things. And so I think those are some of the things that happen. And so all those job opportunities too that do exist, it is awesome to work with the young people that are coming through the Capitol in a variety of different ways. The science fellowships, the Assembly and Senate fellowships, all I think help in the process.
Yeah, thanks for that. And water jobs pay really well. You could go online and find some of the major water agencies and purveyors and look at their starting salaries, and they're quite impressive, as are some of the internships. So we're gonna, look to you leaders in providing examples for how we could get this information in the curriculum. Unfortunately, academia doesn't move as quickly as environmental science or climate science, for example. A lot of people in STEM programs don't get that exposure to policy and stuff. I mean, I came through STEM and environmental biology and ecology backgrounds, and I only took some policy courses because I kind of had to. But then I realized now I learned a heck of a lot there, and I'm glad I did. But you see a lot of jobs. You got to know NEQA, CEQA, and the rest, and that's no joke. And so we got to figure out how to expand that across the curriculum in our universities. Okay, with that, thanks to everybody. This really went well, and good participation, good involvement, and we look forward to our next session in the series, which will be next Thursday, 2:00, same as this one. And that one is called Making Waves, Water Policies and Workforce Needs. And then our third session is just simply the Thursday after that, again at 2 p.m. Many people who registered expressed an interest in all three sessions, so glad to see you there. And students, you could keep your questions coming. And with that, Blake, any final thoughts or adjournment? Take it away.
Thanks, Steve. I just wanted to again express appreciation to the panelists and also to Senator Laird, Assemblymember Soria for joining us today, to our committee consultant guests, to Soren as well from Aqua. Thank you for joining us, and hope you all have a great day. Thanks for participating.
We'll see you next week. Bye.